All right, so it's installed. We actually have a project up. And so what are we looking at? What we're looking at is the universal pipeline, render pipeline template. And it kind of tells you in really technical language what this means. And you're going to read that and not know what the heck it's talking about. And that's fine. Basically, what it means is that there's some cool stuff that you can use in here, including something called shader graph. And it's basically configures everything so that you can use the types of materials and they'll actually display and correctly. And then you can make projects in this, right? And it's just a way that this scene is rendered. Now, let's go ahead and look at this window. So we've got, first, there should be a menu up at the top that has, right, Unity, File, Asset, Edit, Assets, Game Object, Component, Tutorial, Window, Help, right? And that on OS X, that's hidden when I'm full screen. Below that, there's a little toolbar that has a hand, an arrow, right, some other things, and that's how we're going to be navigating and moving around the space. And then there's a couple tools here, one that says pivot, one that says global, and one that basically allows you to lock things to a grid or not. Below that, we have several panes, right? We have the hierarchy pane, we have the scene pane, we have the inspector, which is where all that text is. And then below those, we have the project pane, which has sort of a list of all your assets and things for the project, and then the assets window here. Now, note that there are tabs, and you can have multiple tabs in each of these panes. So there's also this console. And what the console does is if there's some error, like a material wasn't applied right, or you wrote a little bit of code and you failed hard and it's not working, or it can't find a file for some reason, those errors will show up here. Or warnings, because sometimes there's warnings as well that come up. You'll also notice that the scene window also has this game tab under it. And you'll notice that when I click on that, the view changes pretty dramatically. Right? So the view from here is through the actual camera in the scene. And the way that, most games work in 3D space is that the camera is your view of the world. And so if it's a first person experience where you're navigating as a first person, right, essentially these are your eyes. If it was a third person thing, right, where the camera's actually up and behind the character a little bit, right, you would see the character there. There is no character here. There's just a camera right now. And then in 2D stuff, right, there is a camera when we work in 2D mode, but it's sort of just, up above and looking, straight at the scene, and you can lock it onto the character or not, depending on what you're trying to do. So this is the game window, and this is the scene. So this is the window in which you edit everything. This is the window in which you can't edit anything, but it allows you to show what gameplay looks like, what all the render settings look like. And you can see with the way they've set up this little demo scene, it's pretty, it looks pretty great. And, it takes a lot of time to do all the work to develop all the materials for all of these objects and the lighting and everything. And we're going to get to that eventually. But this is just sort of their, look at how pretty the universal render pipeline can be. So above the scene and the game windows are this play arrow, a pause arrow, and this little step arrow. And what those do is it allows you to play your scene in real time in this window. And so let's go ahead and hit the play button. And it takes a second, but then it switches to the game window. And you'll notice the play button is now highlighted in blue, and there's a blue line above the game tab here. And this camera has some code attached to it that allows us to move it. And so if you use the WASD keys and the Q and E keys on your keyboard, W moves you forward, S moves you backward, D is to the right, and A is to the left, and then Q drops you vertically down, and E makes you go up, right? And so I don't know if there's like a rotation command built into this, but this allows you to gives you some motion around this scene. Okay, so to stop being in game mode, you just go up and you go ahead and hit that play arrow one more time, and it'll stop it and switch you back to scene mode. Okay, and so now when I'm in scene mode, there are ways that I can navigate around the scene as well, because I'm going to need to navigate in order to build the scene and add assets and make sure things are working correctly. And so to do that, if you have a mouse with a scroll wheel, right, you can just use the scroll wheel to scroll in closer to your scene or scroll out. If you're using a trackpad, you can just use 2 fingers to zoom in and zoom out. In order to rotate around the scene, what you need to do is you need to hold down the Alt or Option key on your keyboard, and you'll see that my icon changes to a little eye, and then if I click and drag, it allows me to rotate my view around the scene. You'll notice several other things here, like this camera icon, these other icons here, which we'll talk about later, this little light icon over here, and you'll see that this is a sun, which means it's a directional light or an infinite light, as though it is sunlight. And there's another little icon here that shows like a normal, a different type of light. Okay, so I can rotate the view this way. If I say I've zoomed in and I don't want to rotate around, I want to be able to move the camera sideways one way or the other, what I need to do is I need to click on the hand tool up here, right? And so the hand tool allows me to just click and drag right up, down, left, and right in the scene, so I can kind of scoot things around that way. And again, even with the hand tool selected, if I hold down Option, I can rotate as well. Right, so that's pretty simple. Also, there are quick keys for each one of these commands, and they start with the letter Q. So Q is the hand, W is the move tool, E is the rotate tool, R is the scale tool, T is the rect tool, which we're not going to use any. Y is the sort of do everything tool, and then U doesn't do anything, right? You basically click on this last one if there's some custom tools available, which we don't have installed. And then we'll talk about these 3 things in a bit, but we're not going to worry about the quick keys of those yet. Okay, so in the hierarchy, let's go ahead and take a look here. So in the hierarchy, we have our sample scene, which is the scene we're in. That's the name of the scene. And then these are all the objects in our scene. We have a camera. We have a directional light. I'm going to actually zoom out a bit so that when I select these, you can see them. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the letter W or click on the cross arrows here. Because what that does is you can see that now I've got this axis showing up on top of the object that I have selected, right? So I've selected the directional light. If I click on this post-process volume, you're going to wonder what that is. We're not going to worry about that right now, but it's down there. And then there's this object that says example assets. This is the entire scene, right? And so it's sort of like a group that is allowing me to select everything in here. And so I could click and drag on this, and the camera's outside of the group, but I can move this whole thing together as one object. I'm going to hit undo, which is Command or Control Z to undo that. And then if I come over here where it says example assets, I'm going to zoom in a little bit again. You can see that I have this option to flip this arrow down, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And now you can see that within that I have several other objects in here, right? I have this workshop set, which again, if I open that up, you can see I have a whole bunch of different options in there. And if I flip this down, I have a whole bunch of other options under the props, right? And I can select each one of these things separately, right? There's the paint supplies, and again, right, they've like just dropped all of these objects in here. Now, something else you'll note is that there is this eye icon here in the corner, and if I click on that, it hides or makes visible the objects in the scene, right? So, and the little hand basically makes it so I can't move them. It locks it in place, right? So I don't accidentally grab something and move it in the scene when I don't intend to. If and we'll talk about some of these other things. Note there's this search bar here. So if I was to search, click in there and zoom in a little bit, and I know, like, let's say I want the paint can, so I just type in paint. You'll see that it basically just shows me all the things that have the word paint in there, and it grays everything else out. So I have this really nice way of finding something, as long as I've named it well, in my scene. Okay. Also, you'll see this little plus arrow with a drop down next to it. This is how you add new objects to the scene, right? And so if I click on that, you can see there's this create empty child, 3D objects, and there's a whole range of what would be called primitives in here that you can do. There's 2D objects as well, which sometimes are good in 2D mode, but other times you might want, like text that hangs out over a character's head or something like that, and that would be a 2D object in 3D space. There's also effects you can add, lights, audio, video player. There's UI elements, which we're not going to worry about at all right now because they're kind of annoying, but they've changed the way they're doing that, so hopefully that works a little bit better than it used to. I still need to actually go through and use the new system. And then there's these volumes, and we'll get into volumes later, and then you can create additional cameras. Okay, so that's how you create new objects. And all of your objects are stored in your assets folder. So you'll note that there's this example assets, there's materials, presets, scenes, scripts, settings, tutorial info, etc. If I double click on scenes, right now there's just this sample scene and then the sample scene lighting settings, right? Which if I open that up, it kind of tells me all these different settings about lights and in this particular scene. And we're not going to worry about that right now. So if I click back on assets here and I go to materials, currently there's just this skybox material, which is why we have a blue sky with a hazy horizon. There's also these example assets, and so in there, there's also materials, models, prefabs, shaders, and textures, right? The prefab models are going to be all of those objects that we have in the scene. Right? Materials are all in here. This doesn't, when you create a new material or something, it doesn't automatically place it in the folder that it's supposed to go in. You do have to go through and make sure you put it in the right place, or stuff is everywhere. But they give you these folders so you actually have a place to put things in these different sets. Okay, so what we're going to do is rather than manipulate this scene anymore, we're actually going to go ahead and create a new scene. And to create a new scene, what we do is we go up to File and go to New Scene. And then once we've created that new scene, it's currently untitled. So I'm going to click on this little ellipsis over here. And in order to make it not untitled, I'm going to go ahead and say Save Scene. And when I click on that, it's going to bring up a menu, a thing to ask me where I want to save it to and what folder I want to save it in. So to start with, I'm going to name this tutorial 1. And I do want it to be in assets, but I don't want it just to be in the main assets folder. What I want to do is I want to go down to the scenes folder, and I want to save this in the scenes folder. So I'm just going to call this tutorial 1 and click save. Okay, so when I create a new scene, all I get in the world is the main camera, which notice when I click on that, I actually get a preview of what the camera is looking at. You'll see this yellow dot here. That's the sun because it's looking at the sun. And then I have my directional light, which is that sun. And if I click on either of these objects, let's start with the directional light because there's a lot less going on there. And I come over to the inspector, you'll see that this is the name of the object, is directional light. There's a bunch of settings up here we're not going to worry about yet. There's this section here called transform, and there's this section here called light. Each one of these sections is called a component. And the way that Unity works is there are all of these different objects in the scene, whatever you create. They could be assets you've imported, it could be a cube, it could be a sphere, it could be a light, but they're all objects, and each one of those objects has a set of components. And you can add more components on. You'll notice that I've got this add component button here. And so this is where I can add things like, do I want my objects to respond to physics? Do I want them to have a collider? So say you can, I don't know why you'd want to collide with this light, but you could collide with the light, right? Do I, what, and this is how I attach different scripts to control my objects and other things to create behaviors. And so, so that's the way that this works, right? So this is the transform component. And this is the light component is like, where all the settings or all the parameters to control the light are. Right now, the color is this kind of yellowish white. If I click on this, it'll pop up this color panel. I can adjust the color to whatever I want it to be. I can use intensity, right? And there's some other settings here that won't make any sense at this point. The transform, right, controls the position. And yeah. So let's go ahead and look at the camera, because the camera has a bit more going on, right? It has its transform component. It also has the camera component, which controls all of the settings for the camera. It also has this universal additional camera data script, which basically just provides a little bit more support for the camera. But then there's also this audio listener component. And there should only ever be one audio listener in a scene, and that's on. And the audio listener is basically, you can imagine it as like your ears, or the person who's interacting with what you've made. It's their ears, right? And so there's audio sources can be all over in 3D space, but the audio listener is sort of mixing all of those sources depending on how close or far it is from an object that's making sound. And all of that gets tied into the camera. So let's go ahead and create another couple objects. The first thing we're going to create is let's go ahead and create a plane. So we're going to click on that plus sign. We're going to go to 3D object and plane. And once I've done that, I've got this nice plane set in my scene. And just to note, if I go up to the top, to the menus at the top, if I click on game object, that's another place where I can create all the same objects that I would create using this plus sign over here. Right? Unity is pretty, they like to give you many different ways to create objects. So if I right click in the empty space in this window, I will also get the options to create objects and everything else in here. And that menu depends on which pane you're in. If I right click in the scene pane, what that does is it actually does the same thing as holding down option. So I actually get that, rotating of the camera. But you'll notice that it's rotating my view without moving my position, right? I'm not rotating around an object, I'm rotating around the center of my view. If I right click down in the assets folder, you'll see that a bunch of different stuff comes up, right? And there's this create menu that allows me to create a whole bunch of different things that are not necessarily objects that go in my game objects that go in my scene. But we'll look into that a little bit more later. Okay, so let's select our plane. And with the plane, I just want you to see that, yes, there is a transform. There is also this thing called the mesh filter and the mesh renderer. Those are required on basically every object that you create because those allow the object to be displayed properly. Now, there's certain special cases where you might change some of these settings, but typically we leave these pretty much set to the defaults. And the other new thing that's on here, or there's two new things, there's this mesh collider. which basically is a collider. So if an object hits, intersects or touches this plane, the mesh collider basically sends out a message that says, "Hey, something hit me," or "Hey," or if it's another object, like say a player is going to fall out of the sky and smash onto this plane, the player's collider will also note this intersection, right? If things don't have colliders, it's sort of like they're ghosts. They won't actually interact with anything in the world, so they need colliders. And the very last thing is just the default material. This material, it says lit, which basically means that if it's a lit material, it means that lights in the scene affect the way the surface of the material looks. There are also unlit materials, which is what, if you're doing 2D stuff, that's typically the way that works, which means they're self-illuminating, right? They don't, you don't require any lights in the scene. You can have all these unlit materials and they just look 100% brightness all the time. Whereas if you need shadows to be cast cast across stuff, the materials need to be lit. And so it's kind of grayed out because it's just sort of the default thing that's, you can adjust the color maybe. No, you can't even adjust the color, right? It's just so that you see something in the window, right? In order to give this color and things like that, we'll have to create a material and apply it to that, but we're not going to do that in this tutorial. The next thing I want you to do though, is I'd like you to create a sphere. So if I go to the plus sign under the hierarchy and go to 3D object and sphere, right? I can create this sphere, and I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit so it's a little easier to see. I'm going to hold down Option. I'm just going to rotate my view a touch too. And there's a couple different ways that we can move objects around in the scene. If we want to be really precise, we can use the transform component in the game object that we're working on, the sphere in this case. Or we can hover over the handles of these axes and we can move this thing either vertically, if I, in the X direction, which is red, the Y direction is green, the Z direction is blue. You'll also note there's these 3 little planes in here, and that basically means if I click on one of those planes, I'm moving it in this case, the X and Z direction at once. And similarly with, right, all 3. But whatever the case, it locks that motion in a way. And you'll see that, right, I've got a shadow being projected onto the plane from this light. You'll also see I've got a highlight here and some shadowing going on. And you'll notice there's a couple other things on here, right? There's this, the orange outline means this is my selected object. Those green lines, that's the sphere collider, right? If I hide this, if I click on it once, it disappears. If I pop it up, right, it shows up. Okay, so I've got a collider here and I've got a collider on my plane. It'd be nice if I could get these 2 things to interact. And so without any programming whatsoever, we can turn physics on really easily. And so that's really the last thing we're going to do in this tutorial is just, I'm going to leave you with a couple things I'd like you to do. But so to start with, let's go ahead and lift our sphere up pretty high off the plane. And then I'm going to go ahead and, with the sphere still selected, I'm going to click on the Add Component button. When I click on Add Component, I have a whole bunch of possible options down here, right? There's, AR, which stands for augmented reality. There's audio effects, event, blah, 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 blah. What we're interested in is physics, and not physics 2D, but the 3D physics. So I'm going to click on physics, and you'll notice that there's all of these different colliders that I can add. You'll note that by default, when I create a sphere, it already has a sphere collider on it. But what I want in order to make this object react to physics is I need to use this rigid body component. So I'm going to click on that to create a rigid body component. And you'll see that there are several settings in here, right? So I have my mass, which is how heavy this thing is. Mass only matters if this object is hitting other objects that have a rigid body component. and then it will calculate how much mass each one has in terms of, how much motion one imparts on the other, if that makes sense. And then there's drag, which, right, a feather has a lot of drag and will float slowly down. A sphere has very little drag usually, unless it's a very, very light material. The drag is overcome usually by the mass. And so right now it's set to 0. Note that use gravity is on. Currently is kinematic is off. We'll talk about that much later. And there's some other stuff, but we're just going to leave it the way it is. And so now how do I test this to make sure that it works? To do that, all I have to do is click the play button. When I click the play button, I'll go to the game scene and you'll see that the ball drops down. It's pretty exciting. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this, right? And something that I do often when I'm developing stuff in here is, instead of having it flip back and forth between the game and the scene, sometimes it's useful to have both views. And so if I hover over this tab here and I click and drag, I can pull this over either above or below or to the side. I usually prefer the side, right? And so then I can have these two windows side by side. One is the game, what I would see if I was playing this, and the other one is the scene. And so now if I hit play, I can watch both of these things fall at the same time. And you'll see that the sphere just falls straight down and it lands. It doesn't bounce. Nothing happens whatsoever, right? So let's go ahead and make this a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to go ahead and stop it. And the thing we're going to need to do now is, let's say we want this to bounce, right? We want this to have some sort of way of interacting besides just falling and sitting still on the ground. And so I want you to note, under the collider component, there's this material option, and it says none, but it needs to be a physic material, right? And so what we can do is we can create a physic material, and then we can apply it here and make this ball bounce. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to my assets window down here, and I'm going to go ahead and probably put this in the no, wait, not in there. I might put it in the scene folder for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click to open that. I'm in the scene folder. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to create, and then I want to go down until I find my physics material. So here it is, down, about 2/3 of the way down is physic material. I'm going to click on that, and it creates this thing here, and it says new physic material. Currently it's highlighted in blue, which means I can change the name, so I'm just going to call it ball. And so this is because you can create multiple physic materials for different objects, and so they have different properties. But so I have this selected, and you'll see in my inspector now, it's got this dynamic friction of 0.6, static friction of 0.6, bounciness of 0, and then how you want your friction and bounce combined. And we're just going to leave it all average, except I'm going to adjust the bounciness to 0.5. If I hover over any one of these words, it gives me a square bracket, comma 0, and in this case, infinity and a square bracket. That means that for my friction, I can set the friction anywhere from 0 to infinity, right? However, with my bounciness, it has to be a value between 0 and 1. So I'm going to make it 50% bouncy, right? Or half bouncy. All right, so I've set the physic material, but I haven't applied it to this object yet. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on my sphere in my hierarchy. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this ball. I'm going to drag this up, and I could either drop it on the object in the scene window, which if I do that, you'll note that it's populated it here in the sphere collider. I can also click and drag and just drop it straight into that field. Or there's this little target button looking thing here. If I click on that, it'll bring up all the physic materials that I have in my scene, and I can choose between those, right? And so in this case, I don't need to choose anything. So I've got that set. I'm going to go ahead and just push play. Right? And so now my ball bounced a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is, let's make that bounciness. I'm just going to go ahead and set this to 1. And something to note, if I change a setting while the game is playing, it will change it while this is in play, but as soon as I stop it, they've changed it. Great. So as soon as I stop it, it'll stay. It used to be that it would not update, or it would revert back to the settings. But in this case, at least with the physic material, it seems as though it stays. So now if I hit this, it should bounce a little bit more. Right? Okay. Now if I stop this again, if I want this to bounce even more, I can also apply this physic material to the plane. So if I select my plane, you can see, right, there's no physic material set for the mesh collider, right, because it's a flat plane, so they just call it a mesh collider. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on the ball and drag it over here and drop it in this field. And so now it should make this a little bit bouncier, because it should be, yep, you can see that, right, it's, and it may bounce for infinity because it's 100% bounce on both objects right now. So it's just going to continue bouncing up and down forever and ever, right? So what I would like you to do at this point, now that this tutorial is probably pretty long, is I would like you to go ahead and start working with some of these objects. The last thing we should probably do before we do this, I'm going to pull the game window back behind the scene, just so I have a bigger view here for you to see what I'm doing. We should probably adjust scale and things on objects before I let you go. So what we're going to do is, let's go ahead and create a 3D object. We're going to create a cube. And you'll note that everything you create starts at close to 0 in the center of the world. It's not perfect, but it's somewhere close. I'm going to go ahead and move this over a little bit, closer to the camera and up. The way that you adjust scale in here is you can either use the scale tool, which is this little box with the arrow inside of it, or it's the letter R. And if I hover over the center there, I can scale the entire thing uniformly. If I click on one of these handles on the end, I can adjust scale right in other ways. And so I'm intentionally making this cube, and it doesn't really matter what scale, but I'm going to be using it as a ramp. And so it doesn't need to be super wide, but big enough so that the ball can roll down it. All right, so I've set this up. And then just to note, right, there's no units of measurement in Unity. There's no centimeters or inches or whatever. It's all based on just values, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20, 100, 1,000. Right, and so that's just something to note, is that there's no units of measure other than just decimal numbers. Okay, so I've scaled this, and as I said, I want it to be a ramp. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it now. And to rotate it, it's either the letter E, or I can click on the rotate tool at the top of the screen. And you'll notice it's kind of hard to see, I'm sure. But there's a green circle, a red circle, and a blue circle. And if I hover over any one of these and click, it will isolate the rotation in that direction, right? So it's just rotating this way. And now that I've done that, if I can rotate it this way as well. You'll notice that even though I've rotated this, my axes are still aligned with the rest of the world, right? If I go back to move, you'll see that this arrow is still pointing up even though this thing's at an angle. And this is, these are parallel to the axes of the world. Now, if I want to be able to move this locally, or right to as far as just in tune with this object, if I click on the word global up here, it'll switch to local, and you'll see that now the green arrow is perpendicular to the top surface of the object, and when I click this, it's going to move it this way, whereas if I go back to local, right, it's going to move it vertical in the scene. So those are two different ways to move an object. It can stop a lot of frustration if you're trying to, yeah, and you'll figure that out as it goes. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over so it's so it appears to be under that sphere. And then I'm going to select the sphere, which I can just click on the object in the scene window to select it, as well as selecting it over here. And I'm just going to pull this over, lift it up a little bit, pull this over. And then I'm actually going to zoom out a touch. And I'm going to rotate my view by holding down Option and clicking. And I'm going to lift this sphere up a little bit higher. Right, and I'm just going to go ahead and test this real quick and see what happens. And so, right, oh, my camera's in the worst possible spot, so I'm going to pause this. I'm going to pull. I don't want to deal with moving the camera right now, so I'm just going to go ahead and make it so I can see both views at the same time. And so now I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And you'll see as this hits now, the ball is rolling down and then dropping off into infinity. And that ball will continue to fall forever and ever until we stop the play. And you'll see the rotation here. It's spinning in the X direction. Okay, I'm going to stop that. So what I would like you to do is, knowing these basic tools, I would like you to go ahead and play with scaling things, rotating. You can add additional objects that have rigid bodies attached to them. Right, so if I was to go ahead and create another cube and bring this up right about here, and maybe set my, go ahead and click on Add Component and go down to Physics and click on Rigid Body. I'm going to set the mass of this really low to like 0.1 so that when the sphere hits it, it will destroy it. I'm going to make sure it's over the ramp. And I'm not going to give it any physics material right now. I'm just going to see what happens, and then I'm going to adjust the view again so I make sure it's here. I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and we'll see what happens. Right, so you can see that that pushed it out of the way, and then the ball rolls and bounces and flies off into space. Right, so what I would like you to do is, kind of create maybe like a little marble maze or something, or maybe you could create a bunch of dominoes to knock down. But yeah, so use these basic tools to go ahead and create something that is just using the physics engine to create some sort of interactivity when you hit play.